Survival horror, a genre rooted in fear, suspense, tension, and the terrifying fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Being a favorite genre of ours, we at Braindead Studios wondered about where it had all begun. And here's what we found out. Survival horror games. You've all seen them, or at least heard of them. From Resident Evil to Silent Hill to Alone in the Dark, Clock Tower, and Fatal Frame. All of these games have something in common, something that isn't usually present in most other games. Whether through clever sound engineering, an atmosphere that draws you in, a fantastic story, or a combination of all three, survival horror games deliver a feeling of suspense, of horror. The survival horror genre takes pride in immersing players so far into their fictional worlds that they actually begin to fear what's happening on screen.
Kind of interesting in talking about it because it's like what makes a survival game, you know, and I think there's the different. For me, what makes it is every game, you know, you have to kind of survive through. But as far as the survival horror, I always look at it as that kind of either it gets a certain emotion to you that it either tenses you up or it kind of makes you jump every once in a while, or there's this dire need, you know, that's of just insurmountable odds that you have to kind of beat out. In the case of like Resident Evil, it's typically okay, you're a human, let's throw you into a town and you're surrounded by zombies and we'll see you later. You know, work your way out and you're just you know, and then you have to make your way through it.
Story, and even more important, atmosphere, are important elements to any survival horror game, perhaps the most important. After all, you can't become immersed in the game if you don't actually give a damn about what happens to your character. But story and atmosphere in survival horror games, and games in general, have come a long way. Let's flash back to 1986, a happier, simpler time. A time when having a top-notch computer meant you had a Macintosh 2. With not 1, but 2 megabytes of RAM. Followed up by a lightning-fast 16 MHz processor, there was nothing that baby couldn't run. In 1986, a game called Uninvited was introduced to the Mac, and later ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System. It was the first known game to include horror elements into its gameplay and story. Though still relatively limited, the game also introduced difficult puzzles, extreme interactivity, and an inventory system, staples of the genre that last to this day. The game begins with your character regaining consciousness in a wrecked car. It seems that while traveling with your kid brother at night, a shadowy figure appeared on the road in front of you, causing you to swerve off the road and crash. With your brother missing, you have no choice but to search the ominous mansion nearby. To fans of Silent Hill, which came out almost a decade later on the PlayStation 1, this might seem like a familiar scenario. In 1992, a game called Alone in the Dark was released for the Mac OS and DOS. It was a revolutionary game based on the puzzle-solving template of the LucasArts adventure games, such as Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, where gameplay revolved more around solving puzzles than combat and action. But instead of clicking objects in locations with a mouse, you controlled the main character with the arrow keys, with a control scheme not unlike controlling a tank. To fans of the Resident Evil series prior to 2006, it was more or less exactly the same. Another thing that Resident Evil borrowed from Alone in the Dark were the fixed camera angles and pre-rendered backgrounds. Being the first game of the genre to be represented in 3D, it allowed the developers to create much more dynamic camera angles that were previously unattainable on a 2D plane. Another thing that Alone in the Dark brought to the table was a new approach to playing games in general. It severely handicapped the player in terms of speed, health, and ammunition. Dying was easy to do. Not only did this increase the player's need to explore, it also raised the overall tension of playing the game. These elements are found in abundance in survival horror games today. Next comes Clock Tower, a revolutionary game released on the Super Nintendo in 1995. Like Alone in the Dark, Clock Tower's roots are based in the old adventure game point-and-click format, although Clock Tower didn't venture as far as Alone in the Dark did. Clock Tower offered a very new perspective to survival horror games: helplessness. The main character, Jennifer, was unable to fight and could only run and hide from any danger she might come across, namely a creepy maniacal child with cutting shears named Bobby. There were over 9 endings in Clock Tower, one of the first games that allowed players to choose their own paths. Unpredictability was a major theme of the game, and the puzzles that Jennifer would have to solve, and the areas that her stalker would assault her in, were completely random, keeping the player guessing. Clock Tower is one of the most important games in the history of survival horror, because it succeeded in making the player feel as though he or she was not in control, one of the primary factors in what makes a game scary. One year later, Capcom released a game called Resident Evil on the PlayStation 1 that revolved around a zombie outbreak in the fictional Raccoon City. Looking at all the design choices made in the game, it's quite easy to see that it was directly influenced by all the games previously mentioned. A fixed camera, tank-like controls, rationing of health and ammunition, unpredictability, a mansion, and a focus on puzzles, to name but a few. However, it was based more on the Alone in the Dark template than the Clock Tower one, with more of a focus on inventory management and combat, and less on a convincing narrative. Although one could argue that the cheesy B-movie dialogue in the Resident Evil series is what makes them great.
Oh, Jill, what good timing. A moment ago I heard someone's voice coming from this hole. Let's go together since it's dark and we can't see very well.
Genre-based, horror type scenario is mainly elements that you're going to be creating fear. You can take any video game. You can take the most cutest, fluffiest little Hello Kitty Adventure Island. Put a little bit of twist darkness to it, make it a first person, add the ambient sound to the background, bats flying behind her head, have a bat steal the boat, you have fear. You don't want the cute little kitty to get killed, but hey, decapitation happens.
And while Resident Evil went the Alone in the Dark route, another game series by the name of Silent Hill followed the route set by Clock Tower. The Silent Hill series follows a seemingly unrelated number of unlikely heroes and heroines, as they explore the cursed and hellish town of Silent Hill. The narrative and atmosphere is definitely the focus of the Silent Hill series, aiming not only to deliver a constant sense of tension and dread, but also a sense of empathy with the main characters. As with Clock Tower, Silent Hill uses unpredictability and multiple endings to create a playing experience that is never exactly the same. And like Resident Evil 3, the second Silent Hill featured an unkillable stalker in the form of the appropriately named Pyramid Head. The creepy atmosphere and the feeling of helplessness, in addition to the extremely dark plot lines, have propelled the Silent Hill series into the limelight. As you can see, even these modern survival horror series can be traced back to earlier games, which provided the building blocks and mechanics so prevalent in the genre. In fact, all video game genres have an evolutionary path, very often leading straight back to the old text-based games. But even now, the survival horror genre continues to innovate. For example, Fatal Frame, a series that takes the horror away from zombies and hellish creatures to a more classic, even ancient antagonist, ghosts. Fatal Frame combines the helpless exploration of Clock Tower, the eerie atmosphere of Silent Hill, and adds, strangely enough, a dash of RPG elements to the mix. The protagonists of the series deal damage to malevolent ghosts with the aid of an enchanted camera.
I chose the impossible. I chose rapture.
And interestingly enough, even games outside of the survival horror genre have taken many cues and tips from it. Games such as BioShock, Stalker, and Fear have fantastic atmosphere and writing and very tense gameplay, often thrusting the player into a hopeless scenario where all you can do is run.
Become your city as well.
In conclusion, survival horror games have come a long way. From text-based and 8-bit graphics to games that practically simulate interactive horror movies, we can only wonder what awaits us in the future. And until next time, this has been Alex Miller from Braindead Studios, signing out.